Okay, we're gonna start right away with. I normally say how many. I think the real question is how many have not seen the movie. Has anybody here not seen it? Then let's go to the next question. How many have read the book? Not very many. I can't. It's dark. I don't know why they make it so dark there, but it's okay. Maybe they know something we don't know. But anyway, so here's what you ought to know about the book. In the book, there's really almost just a slight patina about reporting. It's just occasionally mentioned we did this and we did that. It's really about the story, which, by the way, is as far as I'm concerned, is admirable. The story isn't about these wonderful, brilliant, hustling, wonderful, cheerful, always right, never make a mistake, look real good reporters who go out and break the story. The story is what you do. And what they did in the book is pretty remarkable because it's about the victims, it's about the church, it's a lot of detail with a lot of, as good reporters should, the back half of the book. Well, I don't get any interest in this book. You buy it or don't buy it. I don't care. But a lot of documents. And why are there a lot of documents? Because that's the way in the investigative world you try to work. You try to work with paper. You try to work with things. So it's great that they did it. And then I have to say to you, since when I go to a movie to suspend belief. Okay, so the cover of the book has a photograph of what is allegedly the Spotlight team, but it's the movie stars who are the Spotlight team. And so, whoa, I say to myself, so you guys, let's start by saying what's real in the movie and what's not real. Were you guys always as cheerful about the story as you make out? Was everybody as acute? Was everybody as noble? Was everybody as willing to take on the church as they? There was some ambivalence, but there wasn't enough, I thought.
Well, first of all, Cy, on the cover of the book, it's a crass marketing ploy. We should just say up front. This is a reissue of the original book that came out in 2002.
Right.
And it's a shameless tie-in with the movie, so that's all that is.
But for a lot of people, there's a confusion. Who are the reporters, who not? Don't you think so? You don't think so? You don't think there's a problem with that?
Well,
I mean,
I'm not losing sleep over that, to tell you the truth.
I think the question I was asking was, how accurate really is the movie?
We think the movie's really incredibly accurate. I mean, given this is a 5-month investigation that's compressed into 2 hours, but we think in substance and spirit, it's incredibly accurate. And that's because the writers, the director, and the screenwriter who co-wrote the script, they spent months interviewing us. And the actors spent a lot of time with us as well. And they were really committed to producing an authentic product. And I think it's just remarkably accurate. It's one of the amazing things about it.
Is there anything in the movie you would have wanted to see? Anything that, any of the internal strife? I mean, come on, it's a tough business being an investigative reporter. Your big enemies are always the editors. I mean, that's true.
Well, there's a pretty good scene of strife in the movie. I think it's probably more honest than anything else I've seen in a movie about journalism. I mean, you do see the tension among the reporters, and you see the tension between the editors and the reporters. I think that's in there pretty well.
But don't you find? I was fascinated. I read the book. I didn't read it before. I read it about a month or so ago, and I looked at it again. Of course, obviously today again. I'm struck by the focus of the book is the story, not about you guys, and you're big deal. You don't care.
Well, we wrote the book. Initially, we were chatting backstage. The impetus for the book was largely defensive. We had broken this story. It was a local story. Eventually, it turned into a national story and then an international story. And we knew we had a tiger by the tail. Became big news, and some reporter from Newsweek came in and did a cover story on the church sexual abuse crisis. And this is what, of course, news magazines do. And this guy got a book contract. And so my guys got all riled up and said, we should do the book. Why should the Newsweek guy, who didn't do the original reporting, do it? So that was the impetus behind the book originally. And this was 2002. And of course, none of us were ever dreamed they would make a movie of this thing. I mean, that was the furthest thing from our mind.
But Si, you're right. The movie's not based on the book. The book is about our reporting. The book is about the story. The book's a very objective account of what we discovered. The movie is something else.
But it's the book that's important. It's really not the movie, in my
It's
view.
the story that's important.
Yeah, and that's what makes this book sort of so fascinating to me, because it's about the story. It's not, All the President's Men again, and
Right.
and which is the way. It's the story.
Yeah.
And anyway, so go ahead, tell us about the story. Tell what was the worst moment for you in terms of doing this story. You guys, by the way, one admirable thing about the movie, they did show that this story had been kicking around. It wasn't just something that walked in. There's always been a muttering about it. Go ahead.
It was not an unfamiliar story to us. We had taken a run at this subject before. In the early 90s, we'd gone after another bad priest named Father James Porter from Fall River, Massachusetts. And I was Metro editor then, and we wrote dozens and dozens of stories about this guy, but couldn't quite get the goods, as happens in newspapering. You don't hit a home run all the time. You hit singles and doubles. And finally, we hit what I thought was a dead end, and I called off the reporters and said, I don't think we have it here. We couldn't get the internal church documents that we were able to get later in this story, which really took the story to another level and prevented the church from alleging media bias the way they had before. The waspy Globe against the Irish Catholic Church, that kind of thing. So along comes Marty Barron, now the editor of the Washington Post, new to the Globe in 2001. He read a column from a Metro columnist who had written a piece suggesting that Cardinal Law knew that they were passing around these bad priests, and he asked us to look at it again. And from my earlier experience going after the other guy, I was initially skeptical, worried about fairness, and whether we were going to the well too often here. But it wasn't long before Mike and the other 3 reporters on the Spotlight team were getting incredible stuff, so we knew we were off.
I think what's important to realize here is we didn't discover clergy sex abuse. It's not what the Boston Globe did. In a way, the story is like Watergate. What we discovered that nobody else had documented before is the cover-up. We discovered and were able to prove with the church's own documents that high church officials knew that a particular serial pedophile priest had spent 30 years molesting children and nevertheless had reassigned him and allowed him to continue molesting more children. It was really the discovery of the cover-up and the fact that we were able to prove it with the church's own internal documents. And that's what made our work different from all the other work on clergy sex abuse that had come before, including the Globe's reporting on clergy sex abuse, which was actually 10 years. What Ben's talking about, coverage of the James Porter case, was 10 years before the Spotlight team came along.
Do you think there's some sort of an analogy between the church's ability to control the media, which it had been doing for so long, and let's say the White House's ability to control the media when you have a powerful institution? Is there something, there's some connection, some sort of similarity?
Sure, I think it's analogous. I mean, at that time, in 2001, the Catholic Church still was the most powerful institution in the city of Boston and the state of Massachusetts, and had been for most of the 20th century. So I think the church was really used to getting its way, and that's why, as you see in the movie, they decided that they didn't have to bother answering our questions. They didn't even need to know what they were. That's how comfortable they were in their position of power.
Do you think, and so the movie for you, when I talk about suspending belief, one should not. One should take the movie at pretty much face value. This is pretty much what happened.
I think you should. This movie is one movie that's not about suspending belief. This movie tells you the real story.
And so, what do you think it costs the paper? Does anybody ever look at it that way? Because this is, we're in an area, my old newspaper, the New York Times, in which I worked for, 9 years, I had these air travel cards, and I would get up and say, I better go see somebody in Paris today, and just go. And nobody ever said, boo. I'm serious. Those days are, of course, long gone. But what did it cost?
Well, it's a very important question because journalism today is in crisis, and it's because we don't have the money that we used to, just as you say. The revenue model for newspapers has been destroyed by the internet. There are a lot of good things about the internet, but our revenue model is destroyed. And one thing you have to realize is that the movie ends on the morning of publication of the first story. And after that story, the story exploded. We added 4 members to our teams. We had 8 full-time reporters. And we worked for another year, producing 600 more stories until Cardinal Law resigned. So we had 8 full-time reporters, plus editors, plus lawyers who we used. And Marty Barron has done kind of a back-of-the-envelope estimate that it cost the Globe $1 million to produce a year of stories on the Catholic Church.
Not counting salaries or counting...
That included legal fees and going to court.
And salaries, yeah.
And so, come on, where are we now?
Yeah, we're in a bad way now, and I think one of the great contributions that the movie makes is to underscore the importance of investigative reporting in a democracy, and it's still newspapers, despite their greatly diminished resources, that have the most reporters, more than radio, more than TV, more than some blogger. They're the ones that still have the horses. But what we're dealing with now is 2 or 3 generations of younger people who have grown up with the idea that news should be free, and they don't want to pay for it. And so when your average newspaper tries to put up a paywall on the internet, people aren't going for it. And so in this atmosphere, there's been tons of layoffs. The Globe today has probably half the number of reporters that it did just 10 or 15 years ago. And there are buyouts, and it's managing decline. It's not a fun time to be in the business. And in that atmosphere with layoffs, unfortunately, too many editors are coming to view investigative reporting as a luxury that they can no longer afford. Because it's 3 or 4 reporters off in a different part of the newsroom. They're out of the paper for 6 months at a time. And the editors are worried about having enough guys just to put out the paper every day.
There's also the strikeout, as an old Ted Williams writer, there's the strikeout quotient because sometimes you just don't make it.
Yeah.
Sometimes you get, and also sometimes you get sued. You get nowadays being threatened with sues. A lawsuit now will pretty much stop newspapers. I think the publishing industry too is also much more leery of lawsuits, taking on a book that will inevitably lead to a lawsuit. There's a lot of more, in my own world, I see a lot more anxiety about it. So what does that mean? That means you do investigative reporters on sitters, on something is going to deliver. In other words, when you decide to spend money on an investigative group of team, most newspapers still, the major newspapers still have teams.
Yes.
But I think that's more risk adverse. You want to be sure you're going to spend $100,000, $200,000, $300,000 for a couple of months on a story. You want to be sure you're going to get one. So,
well, you to that end, you prospect for 2 or 3 months to see if it's there, and you make your best guess, and then
that's expensive.
And then you go. Yeah.
When you were Metro editor,
for a long time, yeah.
You have to do a lot of budget stuff, right?
Yeah.
And what was that like?
Well, it wasn't my forte.
And why do you talk about bloggers in a
derisive way?
I would say derisive is way more polite than your phrase was. So what's wrong with it?
I'll tell you, I think there's a lot of great bloggers out there, I really do. But I think the most significant aspect of journalism in terms of holding powerful institutions and powerful people accountable are journalists who can really get the facts. There's a lot of opinion out there, and there aren't that many facts. And to me, we're drowning in opinion. And what we really need are people who can find out what the facts are, what the story really is, so that people can have informed opinions. instead of what I think are sometimes knee-jerk opinions. But in order for people to have informed opinions, there have to be real journalists out there who are getting the facts. And that takes money. I mean, blogging does not take a lot of money. We could all sit in front of our computers and type. But to get the facts, to get the story behind the story, to investigate powerful people, to investigate powerful institutions, it takes money. It takes money to pay reporters, it takes money to pay lawyers in case we get sued or we need to go chase documents.
But when you talk about, it sound like you're talking about Plato's Republic. We've got to. It's so wonderful. It's a world we have to deal in facts. There's another reality, which is that I watch television. The standards have sort of. I watch during the political year. I watch MSNBC and CNN, sometimes even Fox News. They all have panels, and a lot of reporters go on there. A lot of political people go on. And if you took away these two words, I think, you wouldn't have anything at all that's being said. They all begin every sentence with "I think." There's just no facts left in the world, it seems like.
Right.
And journalists, guys who really have been good, serious journalists, will pontificate about anything.
Right.
So the whole thing seems to be in some sort of steady fall off in terms of even individual integrity. In terms of you go on TV and just talk about something. If you're asked a question, nobody ever says, "How the hell do I know?" Which is the right answer to most questions. And nobody does. So it does drive you nuts. But I think the reality is we have to face up to that this new era. I remember Johnny Can't Read 25 years ago? You guys do, you're not that old. Johnny Can't Read, and then all of a sudden came the email. And all of a sudden Johnny and Judy are writing to each other a lot, maybe cryptically. And now, so you have major newspapers, and the Boston Globe, for example, is not covering the city with as much reporters. Am I right that Boston, one of the colleges there has set up a local team to sort of supplement with the local reporting? Is it Boston College or BU?
It's
BU.
Boston University, yeah.
Yeah, and they do, I gather, a reasonably good job of covering,
sure.
Because you guys can't cover anything because you don't have the staff.
Well, no.
No, come on.
I mean, one thing about, I was saying earlier that newspapers are diminishing their investigative teams. One good thing about the Globe is that the Spotlight team has gone against the grain, and where there were 4 reporters when we did the church story, there are now 6. So that's a commitment. And I think it's...
let me just interrupt to ask, that's not the pattern in most newspapers.
No, I'm saying it's counterintuitive. But I think it's going to take a paradigm shift. I think it's going to take papers deciding to become maybe less paper of record, all the news that's fit to print, if you will, and do more enterprise reporting at the expense of paper of record stuff.
The Globe has made this commitment to investigative reporting, and I think it's terrific, but it has come at a cost. I mean, for instance, we've closed all our foreign bureaus, every single one of them, and we've closed all our national bureaus except for Washington. So we have just made different strategic decisions, but we're cutting like everyone else. We've just decided that investigative reporting matters for altruistic reasons, but also, we do readership surveys, and I think there are a lot of people out there who want investigative reporting. We do our readership surveys, and they love the Spotlight team, and they want journalism that holds people accountable. So we've made some strategic decisions that other papers have not, but it has come at a cost. There's no doubt about it.
Well, I wonder about the future, because I think we have to face up to the fact that there's going to be a whole different media, and we're coming that way. Tweeting, if you will, is becoming an important
You don't
part
tweet
of
much, Si?
My children don't let me, because they said, don't read it, don't read about them, and don't do it. All 3 of them said that's so I'm not allowed to. And so I think I saved myself. On the other hand, the good thing about tweeting is if a plane goes down and you've got people watching, they can fill you in with stuff right away. That's sort of an interesting thing. On the other hand, for me, the bad thing about tweeting is you're going in Washington. If some of you know downtown Washington, there's a couple bars near the White House, the Old Epic Grill, for example. And maybe at 2 or 3 o'clock on a Sunday morning, if Saturday night, Sunday morning, you're walking past the White House and you've had your scotch or whatever, and you're Irish, if you're from Boston, and you see lights on in the 3rd floor of the old executive office building next to the White House, and you tweet, lights on the 3rd floor of the old executive office building, and the next thing you know, it's all over the goddamn world.
Yeah.
And it's a couple of guys, the janitor crew, working in the 3rd floor that day. So there's the downside. You can have that kind of an insane sort of response.
But guess what? It's not just reporters that's tweeting. Guess who else is tweeting today?
Yeah,
Donald Trump.
You bet.
20 million followers.
You bet.
And going over the heads of all of us in the press.
And I would say there's going to be more critical reporting. You can't be much more critical than you are. But I always, well, it's, you know, it ain't over, this election.
Not at all.
Not at all.
Not at all.
And
Anything can happen.
well, it's just there's something out there that, you know, that the press is sort of. I think the press generally, the mainstream press, likes order too much, and now everything's ordered. And it's not going to be that orderly. I also think everybody underestimated the impact he had of the TV show he had. What was it called?
Apprentice.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
He had a lot of people.
He's a celebrity.
I think that was the beginning.
Yeah.
I think that was the beginning. So I don't know where we are with all this stuff, just covering the election. I don't know where we are. It's the most interesting time, and I wish the newspapers. I can't talk about the old days because that's just crazy, but it's too much surface coverage. We really should get into it and get into who he is and what he's done. I know we're seeing some of it, and we should get into all the candidates. I mean, there's a reason that two of the major candidates have such big negatives, and so you know, it just seems to me that we've passed the crossroads, and I guess what it means is the classic thing about definition is about education is we're all going to have to be our own thinkers. It's going to. I think the whole point of education, it seems to me, is critical thinking. It's being told from the very beginning that just because you've got a professor who's written a book on the subject doesn't mean that's correct. That's a stupid way of putting it. It means you have to. The public's going to have to read more, demand more of itself. It's going to have to be a collective change. It isn't happening because it's not going to be filled by the newspapers. The problem with somebody like me who's a very careful newspaper reader is I'm also online reading the papers, and I don't see how they can keep on going when every morning most of the stories in the paper I've read the night before. There's something wrong with that picture. In other words, the newspapers have to sort of. This is all pie in the sky eye, whatever it is. Anyway,
I worry about the demand for investigative reporting. I hope people are interested in it, and you know, you hear these surveys that say so, but you also, you know, you're dealing with a whole cohort out there that seems to have the attention span of a gnat, and they just want to read headlines, and they don't want long-form journalism and long narratives and investigative pieces. And I worry about that. I worry about whether there's the enough appetite for it, and that goes to citizenry and being well-informed and all of that.
well, the AP. I started one of the sort of real job I had was working for the Associated Press, and I did it for years. And I covered. That's how I began OJT, learning to hate the Vietnam War by covering it, you know,
Sure.
mass murder and all that stuff. But there was no limit on you could write a story. Now the AP has put out my understanding is they don't like stories more than 500 words.
Yeah, right.
I worked in the old days for William Shawn.
Yeah.
In 70, I worked for the New Yorker for a couple of years before I worked for Abe Rosenthal at the New York Times, which is a kick. Anyway, I once apologized for some piece I wrote for Sean, and he said in that little wizened voice he had, he said, "Oh, Mr. Hersh," he said, "stories are never too long or too short. They're too interesting or too boring."
Well, I think he's right, and I think that holds true today. And in fact, I think what a lot of the surveys are showing is that there is an appetite for long-form journalism, and there is an appetite for investigative reporting, long-form. What the surveys show is people like the short stuff, and they like the long, in-depth stuff as well. What they don't like is the kind of thing that most newspapers spend most of their time doing, which is producing the daily 800 to 1,000 word to 1,200 word stories about what happened yesterday.
And
that's what
everybody read online.
That's everyone has read online. So I think newspapers are going to have to change, and it's a high-risk proposition. But I think the long-form investigative reporting is going to survive. It's going to come in a form that we can't predict yet, but I really believe it's going to survive. You know, I was a judge for the Goldsmith Prize this year. It's a Goldsmith Prize for investigative reporting, and which is given by the Shorenstein Center at the Harvard Kennedy School. And we had 180 submissions. And I would say that half of them were terrific examples of really important watchdog journalism. And trying to pick 6 finalists was just incredibly difficult because there were so many high-quality submissions. And picking a winner was an exercise in absurdity. So, you know, I think investigative reporting is in demand. You know, good quality investigative reporting is in demand, and it's going to have a home, whether it's in a newspaper that looks a lot different than newspapers look today, or it's online, or it's going to be published by a nonprofit organization. I really do believe it'll survive. Maybe I'm a crazy optimist, but I really believe that's true.
Well, that's... And one of the things you said is that we now have ProPublica.
Yes.
And we have, I'm always scary about things financed by multi-billionaires. That scares me generally because I don't quite know, like the Washington Post, I don't quite know what Bezos wants or where it's going, but it seems to be okay. But I just, but that's, in other words, some of the newspapers may be saved because of the thing that Bernie talks about, the system right now that creates such high incomes, and people may just dabble in the newspaper business just as you know, as sort of a public gesture. But that worries me about the future. I think blogging, and I think what's happening is the future. I hate to say it. I think in the long run we may not even have print newspapers. Maybe they'll stay. Certainly, the New York Times will stay a long time. The Wall Street Journal still has a much higher circulation, by the way, almost 2 to 1 over the Times, 1 million a day, and the Times is only about 530,000 a day. But blogging is I think the future is with the young kids.
Well, yeah, but bloggers need editors. Who are the gatekeepers?
Where's the money going to come?
You can't just blog and throw it out there.
Well, that's what's happening now, pretty much.
I know, but that's pretty dangerous. I mean, where's the quality control?
Well, newspapers are going to disappear. There isn't any doubt about that. Newspapers.
But they're here.
Well, okay, but
so there has to be some sort of advanced thinking about the future.
I do think when the baby boomers start to, it's the baby boomers, older people who have grown up with newspapers who still rely on it, who like to hold the product, the physical thing, and who are the most resistant to going online. But in the next 20 years or so, as those folks, pass, I think everything will be online. Let's face it.
Do you read Kindle? Do you do books on Kindle?
I could do a little Kindle, yeah.
Yeah, I never thought I would, but I do it. It's there.
So it's great on an airplane.
Traveling,
Yeah, forget about traveling. It's just a handy way to read books.
Yeah, it is.
It actually is.
Very. Yeah.
And I don't know what the numbers are in the publishing industry, whether or not it's a profit center or not. I can't imagine. Some of the new books, actually, they charge $14, $15 for or something like that. But anyway, this is totally, it's in flux, to put it mildly. And I think long-form journalism, my guess is going to be, we're going to have some major blogs that are going to be major news. We're going to have different form. We're going to have the ProPublica, which is financed by a private guy. He puts up $10 million a year, and they've won some prizes, and they do a lot of good journalism.
Yes, they do.
And they tie in. Even I've seen them tie in with the New York Times even,
yeah.
And the New Yorker even now is tying in.
Yeah.
Because
sure.
Everybody's looking for a way to save money on product.
Right.
And so I don't know what the form is going to be. It's going to be a lot different. I don't know what it means. I think you're basically right. I think there's still a great appetite for long-form journalism. But what are we going to do? We're reducing foreign coverage. Foreign coverage is also, most of it, so much more is written out of Washington about the foreign coverage. And it's just, if you don't go someplace, I sound like such a stick in the mud. There is something about getting a sense of a place.
I think Americans have less and less appetite for foreign news, I'm sad to say.
Well, because it's all been so bad. I mean, what the hell?
But so I find that very troubling. I agree with you. I mean, I do consider myself sort of a glass half full type of guy, but we are in a period of crisis in journalism. There's no doubt about it. And the decline of foreign affairs is a big part of that. I mean, writing stories about the world from Washington is no way to cover international affairs at all. It's very, very troubling. And I believe the newspapers are going to go. I mean, there's no doubt about it. Everything will be online probably very soon. The question is, how are we going to fund news organizations that can produce high quality, accountability journalism? That's the question. And there's a lot of experimentation going on. And I hope something works.
Well, some of it may end up being in academia. University of California does a lot of good stuff. They run a workshop. They work with Frontline. Of course, I used to do some documentaries in the 80s for Frontline, and we'd sometimes get an audience. This is here we go, talking about how wonderful things were in the old days. But we'd get an audience of 12, 15 million people. Now their ratings are 1.5. So nobody's watching public television news very often. Their documentaries. The networks don't even think about a documentary. I mean, when you go to Europe and you look at the quality of television stuff that's done there and the reporting that's done there, and you see the paucity of stuff here, and the corporate control of the media, all these cliches, it is a little dark. And I could just tell you, lying now is just the norm in Washington. It's just the norm. It's just so much easier to lie. It's so much easier to lie than to tell the truth. So lying is the norm, and it's crazy.
I think the question of how daily newspapers are going to be monetized is the key for the future. In other words, how are you going to get people to engage with the newspaper's website and to pay for the paywall? I think one of the most important things that people can do is support their local newspaper by getting an online subscription. It's cheap, $3-4 a month, and that's
doesn't happen. It's going to be sugar daddies, I think, in the short run. It's going to be rich people.
Well, maybe it is. I mean, now it's sort of like pick your billionaire. I mean, the Globe is owned by a billionaire, and the Washington Post is owned by a billionaire, and Reuters is owned by a billionaire. So it's kind of where we're headed.
Do we want state-controlled? We want government-controlled media. We don't want it at all.
Personally, very uncomfortable with that.
Yep.
We're
I would think so.
Yeah. We're supposed to be, we're the watchdogs of government. I just find it a very uncomfortable position to be taking money from the government.
Well, that's what makes the Globe is special. You guys know that. And the way you wrote your book was really old-fashioned. It was just wonderful. You wrote the book about the story, not about you.
Right.
It wasn't about how you did it. It's the story. That's the way you did it in 2002. Do you think if you had to write that book today, you'd do it the same way, or would you sex it up by writing about how you guys did this and that?
No, we do it the same way.
Yeah.
Same old dumb way, right?
Yeah. No, our hearts were in the right place. The movie thing was just like an ice cream cone. I mean, that was totally unexpected, out of left field. And but one thing we've noticed about the movie is that it's reaching a whole different audience, because movies percolate into the culture in a different way than our original stories in the Boston Globe did, even though they were amplified online and they got the Pulitzer Prize. But we've been struck by people's reactions to the movie, and you get a whole second wave of victims of sexual abuse coming out and telling their story again, which is good.
How about other stories, other tips? You're getting more tips? Are people from around the world calling up and say, hey, you guys, you want a really good story?
To be honest, I'm being deluged with tips. Yeah, I mean, deluged.
Oh, that's so terrible.
It's pretty remarkable. I mean, 80% of them are not very good, but plenty of them are pretty good. I mean, I'm at the point now where I don't know how I'll ever have time to look into everything that's coming across the transom. It's had a very noticeable effect.
So it's there. There's a market there for this stuff. I don't know. It's in most of the institutions I worked for, when people tried to get to me with a tip, they couldn't get past the switchboard. That's the way it always was. Are they getting past the switchboard to you? Are you more sensitive to it?
Well, I can't tell you how many times I get an email, and I try to answer all my email. I don't always succeed, but I can't tell you how many times I get an email back right away saying, my God, I can't believe you answered my email. And or someone will call me on the phone and say, "You mean you answer your own phone?" But of course I do. Yeah.
So here we are. Let's see. It's year 15 of a war that, how's it going? Not so good. Is the public crazy and enraged about the war? Is there an anti-war movement? Is there a tremendous drive? Does the Bernie Sanders phenomenon spill over to anti-war? I think it's mostly about the economy and about the sense of unfairness in the economy, which is real. But whatever happened to the idea that, back in the old days, in the Vietnam War days, we had moratoriums, we had hundreds of thousands of people marching. What have we lost?
We've lost the draft. I think when there was a draft, I think people had a direct interest in whether this country was at war or not.
Yeah, for some, but that's minimizing it. That's demeaning it.
Well, but I
there was a real sense then of right and wrong. And, America now tends to, the view from Washington is we're always right. The president can decide we're going to put 250 Special Forces troops into Syria, and we're going to show those Russians and the Hezbollah and the Iranians, we're going to show them. But those three people were asked in by the man who the UN recognizes as the leader of Syria, the guy running Syria, Bashar Assad. We weren't asked in. And of course, and is there any criticism about it? Does somebody say, well, would he put 250 Special Forces guys into Israel or Canada with that ease? So, and we don't get a sense. What I don't see in the newspapers is I see more going along. I don't see any real sense. I don't see the newspapers leading. I used to joke at the New York Times as don't expect a social movement out of the New York Times. If something important happens, we'll know about it 6 months later. But we'll know about it. We'll get to it. But I see that missing. I see the edge off. And maybe it's just because, I still want the edge. But I see the edge off. I see investigative reporting that's safer. A lot of reporting on social issues that are very important. The poverty, racial issues. These are all important. I'm not suggesting otherwise. But some of the real hard issues about, what are we doing in the world?
Yeah.
How are we seen? They're not done. And for one thing, because it takes foreign reporting. Go ahead, let's hear. Say it.
Well, I sort of go back to what I said before, that I think in terms of foreign affairs, I think most of the thrust of what you just said is the implication that there's not enough vigilance to what the U.S. is doing abroad. I think the country is looking inward, and perhaps Trump personifies that. And he wants to become less engaged with the world. He's an America First guy in the old sense and the new sense. And I don't know, investigative reporting, as we know the term, tends to be local, or perhaps national, but not foreign. Well, you did me lie.
No. I'm the New York Times and the New Yorker. There's a lot of spunny.
Okay.
But why not? Why not take a look at the word exceptionalism? American exceptionalism. What the hell is that about? Yeah. What is it about? I mean, it's really worth looking at. It's a complicated issue. And if you go look at people around the world, you'll see a much different opinion about American exceptionalism than we have here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no question about it.
And we just had a story in the paper the other day, was it today? I don't know, about a lot of uprisings. Some of the guys that were in Guantanamo may be responsible for killing Americans.
Yes.
And it's page one story, absolutely written the way it's briefed, not saying, wait a second, 3 months in Guantanamo, and these guys, some of them are doing 5, 10, in a society where revenge is very important. You didn't have to be Al-Qaeda when you got in there, but you were Al-Qaeda when you got out.
Right.
I'll tell you, that's never even looked at.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And the fact that we still have a place like Guantanamo is still not looked at. And we all know I just see all these things that could be done, and I don't know, but it's more than just falling through the cracks, and that's why when they said come, and I wanted to talk to you guys, because you guys did something. You took on a group with as much clout in Boston. What more than 2 million of the, I think it was, statistic was 2 million of the 3.8, is it, population, or 3.2 population?
It's the most Catholic city in America per capita.
I mean, God, to take them on. You guys know what happened to the Rosenthal's, Rosie, the editor of in Philadelphia. Remember that story? The church beat him. He was a former copy boy at the New York Times. Became a great reporter. Became editor of the Philadelphia Inquirer and took on the church and lost. Was fired. And that was right. That was after your story. It's about 10 years ago. So you guys took on the church, and is it just because you did? Was there something else? What do you think? What made you do something that hadn't been done because you got some documents? Is that what it is?
Well, the documents was the key difference. Again, it was not an unfamiliar story, but we just were able to take this one to the next level where it became bulletproof because the church couldn't criticize it anymore because this was their own documents showing the extent of the cover-up. And once the story ran, the church totally fell on its sword. There were mea culpa, and Cardinal Law he did a serial apology tour for a year in an effort to save his job, and unsuccessfully. And they never challenged the story in any way because it was their own documents.
In the movie, I would have. It would have been great if they'd done a little bit more in law. That was the one thing that I really missed, because your story, the book is, it's an amazing detail of this man of great humility, being served by nuns on silver. I mean, there's a scene in there that's out of in the Vietnam War. That's how every 4-star, every 2-star division commander, with the kids in the field, not showering for weeks, and the generals all had served dinners with on silver, on plates and all that stuff. And
well, that's how it was with Cardinal Law. I mean, he was incredibly privileged, incredibly arrogant. He lived in a huge mansion. He was
but you do that, and I missed that in the book. I missed that in the movie.
Yeah,
that's all. But
well, they made a decision in the movie to end it where they did, and when we first read the script, we were a little concerned about that. It felt too abrupt, and it didn't show enough of the results, that the cardinal did resign, and that the story spread around the country and the world. But they do that in the movie in a very effective way when they show at the end all the cities around the country and the world. And Jesus, the first time we saw the movie in a crowd, the people gasped at that. Gasped. And so it's a movie, they make artistic choices, and I think it worked.
Oh, are you kidding? It worked. It worked. It just didn't have much to do with the book you wrote, that's all. That's my attitude, but that's okay.
That's true.
That's just the way it is.
Yeah.
I mean, so what, right?
Yeah.
We should do some questions before everybody goes to sleep. I don't know, there's no answers here. I mean, I guess the answer is everybody should just be their own, do their own critical thinking.
Well, also everybody should support good journalism. As Ben said, everybody should subscribe either to a newspaper or a good online news vehicle or a nonprofit that does good work. I mean, this is really up to you. You have to support good quality journalism if you believe it's important. So
but that's not going to happen. People are
sure it'll happen.
You're going to have to entice them. You're going to have to make it something. I just don't think the model in New York, where everybody is tuned in. I'm sure everybody here reads the New York Times, and it is our best newspaper by far, and it's probably as good as there is in the world. It's a great newspaper still. It has a great staff and a lot of very talented people. But still, every morning I look at the New York Times and I've read every story.
You've read it online.
I've read it online. So I
Right.
keep on saying to myself, I don't ever say, why am I subscribing? Because that's like my arm.
But you pay for an online subscription.
I'm sure I do.
Well, that's what I'm talking about. You don't have to subscribe to the newspaper. If
I'm
you
married.
take
I
out
don't know what I pay
Take
for.
out an online subscription. I mean, that's fine.
I don't know anything about
Yeah.
what I pay for. I don't. Are you kidding? Married forever. All right, here we go. Now we get back to report. Here's a reporting question.
Okay.
And instead of dealing in the cosmic level, for you two guys, given the emotional trauma faced by many of the victims, how did you approach these victims, truly survivors, to earn their trust? And And did you, along with those lives, how often did you encounter former victims who felt writing the story violated their trust too and experiences? So, but go ahead. So how did you do it? The movie actually has some of that. That's some of it. But it had to be more, it just couldn't be that easy. You know, the movie has somebody walking down the street and he's pouring out his heart to a reporter. So how was, and were there some guidelines that people, did you set some ground rules? You're the truck element, you know, you come across as the old, you know, where's the cross the dot editor? That, which is what you are, right? Aren't you? Yes?
I don't know. I mean,
Where's the documents? I don't trust this. Go back and give me more. I want more sources on the record. That's what I used to hear from guys like you.
yeah.
Hard-nosed guys.
It's a little overdrawn. I'm a little more subtle than that. I like to think.
But no, but you're essential. I mean, you generically are essential.
But go ahead. Talk about how we approach the victims.
Well, first of all, one of the most rewarding things about this movie and about our work, I mean, the survivors, the victims, they love the movie because it validates their story. And the same is true for our work. I mean, we have these incredibly rewarding and at times heartbreaking relationships with the victims and survivors. So that's been a deeply rewarding aspect of the whole experience. I mean, how we approach the victims, I mean, I think you approach a victim with, with empathy. And there's a scene where Mark Ruffalo, who plays me, of course, is interviewing a victim, and Mark, it's very accurate. He agrees at first it's going to be all off the record, and I'm not going to use your name, and et cetera, et cetera. But by the end of the experience, the victim says, "Hey, you can use my name. You can use it on the records. Go get these bastards." That's
standard. That happens a lot. If you show that you're straight.
Exactly.
And so
exactly.
Here's another question. You do realize this is all child abuse.
Oh yeah.
This is and you've got a church that never approached the problems in terms of the child abuse issue. They never really looked at it. And how did you keep from being so goddamn mad at those people?
Well, I did get mad at them, frankly. And I can't tell you how many times I had to remind people that child abuse in the Catholic Church is not a mistake. And while it may be a sin, it's also a crime. And it's illegal. And, it's punishable by long prison terms. And so, sure, when I heard story after story of people whose lives had been destroyed by the experience of being not only molested or raped as a child, but by a trusted figure, a priest, a person who's supposed to be the most trusted figure, sure, I got angry because I'm a human being.
And some of the stories in the book are really astonishing. I mean, how these things lingered. And how people, 30, 40 years later, will come forward and talk about what happened to them. Anyway, I just found, it's not that I thought the movie was great. It was great entertainment. But, it wasn't what the real story is. The story is what you guys did and how you did it. And here's a question that's sort of a lot of smart questions. This is actually an articulate, literate audience. What is going on? Given that the Globe had received info about the abuse and even covered it briefly before the Spotlight investigation, did the Globe engage in any critique or examination of how it missed the opportunity to dive deeper and uncover the bad acts earlier? You mentioned that it was a question of documents. You couldn't get them earlier.
Yeah, no, I don't think there was any post-mortem. Well, the movie implicitly raises the question of...
explicitly.
Why didn't, yeah.
Explicitly.
Okay,
does.
Explicitly. Why didn't we get it earlier? And implies that we were part of a culture of deference, which I don't quite agree with. Since we did make a run at it before, and the fact is you can't always get the story before. And there's a line in there, somebody says, well, it took Spotlight to get it, the resources of this investigative team and a more concentrated effort. And the difference between the earlier efforts and this effort was the documents, and because that's what really insulated us from any criticism. The church could say nothing because these were their documents.
And in the earlier case, you didn't have enough.
No, we just couldn't get enough.
Were you there when in the movie he was? That's not mentioned in the book. There was a scene in the movie where somebody upbraided you because he'd come 5 years earlier and with a box of documents.
Yeah, who was the guy?
Phil Saviano, yes. Yeah.
He said he came to, well, he did. He came to a couple of reporters, and you know how it is in a newspaper. I mean, people come with tips all the time, and you make a decision that may be the wrong decision, and maybe you have another more pressing story that you're interested in, but for whatever reason, it didn't percolate up, and so he was frustrated. And
Was the publisher on the ball, on the team all the way? Was he behind you, the publisher of the newspaper?
we signed off.
Yeah, yeah. But so I just want to stay on that point a little bit because newsrooms are, as you know, incredibly chaotic places, and tips come in every day, and a lot of them are taken by student interns sitting on the city desk. And as Ben said, reporters, especially daily news reporters, often have 3 or 4 stories they're working on. And the other point I think to make here is we now know that this phenomenon of clergy sex abuse was happening in every major city in America, probably most countries in the world with significant Catholic populations. But in any event, every major city in America where this was happening had a major metropolitan newspaper. And I think the story was sitting there in plain sight for any newspaper, anywhere. And the Boston Globe did it, and the Spotlight team did it. But I think one point I think the movie is trying to make, and I think this is partly what makes it a terrific movie, is that we all have a collective responsibility to speak out when we see something happening that's wrong. And I know that there were reporters and editors all over America who knew about the story and didn't do anything about it. So I have no doubt about it. I've heard from some of them. I think there's all that to consider as well.
Hiding in plain sight, that's the old cliche. I'm from New England, somebody says. That validates them to raise a question, I guess. The movie was also about the city of Boston. I'm trying to read his writing. Did the story shed new light on the city for you, as people who live and love Boston, I presume? Did Boston change after the story? And what did it say about Boston values, that this sort of, as we say, the story that everybody really knew a lot about was just, that was buried so long? Is there something unique about Boston? Head in the sand and all that stuff, or what?
I think the story changed the culture of deference that did exist, and that there's much, when you looked at the police force and you looked at the DAs and the prosecutors, they were, almost uniformly all Irish Catholic and very sympathetic to the church. And I think one result of this story was that it changed that mindset of automatic deference to the church. And in fact, laws have changed now, and there is mandated reporting of sexual abuse across the board now, across the state, right?
Right, when the Catholic Church and priests had been exempt previously.
They've been exempt, which shows the extent of deference.
They've been exempt?
Before the Spotlight, before we published our stories, there's what they call, and most states have this, but in Massachusetts, there's what they call a mandated reporting law.
Yes.
So that, for instance, teachers, social workers.
They were not
police,
on it. That's part of the book.
If they have evidence of child sex abuse, they have to report it. But priests were exempt. And the church fought efforts to include priests on that list for years and succeeded.
It's a major part of one of the major themes of the book is how the church got away with what it wanted. And here's one, just on as if any of us know the answer to this question. This is one. Do you think that it's possible for the church to recover from this scandal? And it's one of those one should say, how the hell do we know? But certainly the new Pope helps. I mean, he does help, and he's been a force. Although there's a lot, why do you shrug like that?
Well, he's good. He's good, but he's got some blind spots on this issue too.
Like what?
Well, you're the expert on this. Go ahead.
Well,
Are you Catholic? Is that it?
I was raised Catholic.
And this guy's not, clearly. Go ahead.
So,
I mean, clearly.
Clearly.
you know, I think
I know the old man. The old man was
Yeah.
never went near a church in his life, your old man. Go ahead.
Well, I think the church has said a lot of good things about its intentions to deal with the issue of clergy sex abuse, and it's made some promises. And I'll just cite a couple of examples. Pope Francis appointed a commission to study clergy sex abuse, and the new Archbishop in Boston, Cardinal Sean O'Malley, is the head of that commission. But it's going on 3 years, and I can tell you survivors all over the world are waiting for this commission to issue its findings or to make some recommendations, and so far nothing has
So
happened.
the fix is in a little bit too, huh?
And the Pope Francis also said that a tribunal would be established to hold bishops accountable, bishops who cover up for clergy sex abuse. And just last weekend, it was announced that there was not going to be a tribunal. There will be no tribunal. And instead, what the Pope did is he amended some of the previously existing provisions in church law to hold bishops accountable. But I think a lot of survivors are viewing this with a certain amount of disappointment and skepticism.
So this is potentially another story for you guys, yes?
Well, I like to say it's one reason why accountability journalism has to survive, because we need reporters to hold local bishops accountable, and we need larger news organizations to be holding the Vatican accountable.
So here's where the question of money and resources really comes in. Do you feel the media functioning as, quote the unquote, the fourth branch of government is gone? How can you hold powerful people and institutions accountable when access is so key to a reporter's livelihood? That's a separate issue, but it's also important. If you don't, you can't depend on the beat guy to deliver the goods. That's the beats guy, the guy doing the beat, covering the White House, he's got to have access. The guy covering the presidential candidates, even whether it's Trump or Sanders or Hillary, has to have access. That means
Well, that's partially true. That's one reason our religion beat writer at the time, we kept him separate from the investigation, because he was the guy that had to go on and deal with the church all the time.
He had to see the cardinal.
He came in with the follow stories, but not part of the original investigation.
So here's a question for both of you. I think we ought to think about, well, there's two. One is, what advice do you have for young people interested in becoming journalists or entering crisis zones? What advice would you give to young journalists?
About getting into the business, is that the question?
Well, just what advice, just generally, somebody, you've spoken at journalism schools and you...
Well, sure. I mean, I like to be honest with people and say, this is a financially challenging situation. There's no doubt about it. And you could make more money going into another profession without any question. But I think if you want a life of meaning and purpose and you want to have a chance to change things and make the world a better place, I think journalism is a pretty good profession.
How about just saying... what I always try to say is also you have to read before you write. That's part of the business too. It makes it very tough. You really have to, we can't have all these people running on TV every night talking about what they think, going time. And I'm talking about serious reporters. And I'm making a mockery of themselves, I think, really, in my case. Okay, so there's one more question that was interesting here. Well, I don't want to do that one. But, it's fun to have this power. I should have been an editor. Okay, I think we've run through the ones that are, I was very interested, the thing that interested me a lot about the whole thing was, in the book, it's a very strong theme, really taking the church to task for not having any real profound sense of reaching out towards the young victims. The church's whole response was to protect the priests, and never exhibiting from top to bottom, really. Of course, there were exceptions, but generally, at the higher up you got in the hierarchy, the less thought, the less sense of guilt they had, the priests, and somebody saw, priests acting as soldiers and giving last rites and seeing how they, the integrity that they have and the respect they have, it's pretty shocking. I don't know where we are, and this isn't for us to answer. But I thought by you guys raising that question all the time, you were really sticking it in. And that's also, I wanted more of that in the movie, to be honest. I wanted these guys to pay more. I wanted to know more. I wanted the complete indifference to the victims. And I think, is that a fair thing to say? Were there exceptions? You didn't have many in these accounts.
So I think it's a fair thing to say, and I think we were very, very shocked by that. There was a point where we went to court to get documents that had been produced as evidence in some lawsuits, and we succeeded in getting these documents. And there were 10,000 pages of documents on one priest who had spent a career molesting children.
The guy with the G.
Yeah, it's Father John Gagan. And we went through these documents, and time again, John Gagan would get caught. They'd take him, they'd send him to some psychiatric facility, and then he would be brought back and allowed to resume his ministry. And so every time he got caught, there was a letter from Cardinal Law, and it would say something to the effect of, "Dear Jack, we're so grateful for your ministry, and we're sorry for this bump in the road in your career, and we're sure you'll go on to do great things." And nowhere in these 10,000 pages of documents was there any understanding or sympathy for the victims. It there just wasn't any. It just didn't exist.
Here's a quote from one of the back 25%, quarter of the book, was a lot of documents. One of the lines was to this incredibly psychotic priest who, over 200 incidents at least, would you say, over
sure.
30 or 40 years, ended up, the penultimate graph says, "I know that the time ahead has the potential," this is when they're sending him off to some farm to pretend that he's getting treatment, which never really happened.
Right.
I know this is the kind of stuff that drove me nuts, I must tell you. I can imagine what you did when you saw it. Even a cynical editor like you said manna, right? This is it. "I know that the time ahead has the potential to be an opportunity for much personal insight and growth in response to God's care and love and merit." This is like a parody. And love in the various ways it may be manifest to you. It's like Marty Python. This is really a Marty. It should be Marty. In various ways that may be manifest to you. "Be assured of frequent remembrance in my prayers. With warmest personal regards and my appreciation for your cooperation and your efforts, I remain." Basically, is he? A what? What is this?
Well, I think there was clearly, shocking and callous indifference to the victims by the hierarchy. But it's also important to note, I think, that our objective here was to try and root out and expose individual bad priests. We weren't indicting a religion here. We weren't trying to take down the Catholic Church in any way.
No.
And at one point, I thought it was important that we step back amidst all the wave and torrent of terrible stories. I thought it was important that we step back and do a few pieces about the good priests that were still out there in the trenches and doing good work. So we did that. And I think we found that while people were incredibly disillusioned, Catholics, by the stories, that some did leave the church, but others found way to cherry pick and stay in, reject the institution, but still find ways to keep their faith.
Well, I guess to close, just for what it's worth, I'm a total Jewish atheist, what you will. That was a description of somebody in Washington recently, some guy running for office. But anyway, and I had an interview talked about Father O'Connor, who was the Archbishop of New York, who was one of the guys who opened his church to the poor, but was very strong on the birth control issues and other issues, very, very orthodox and very stiff. But he also, so I had to interview him about something, and he had been a two-star Marine priest and had given last rites to maybe hundreds of Marines in Vietnam. And I'm writing about My Lai, so I was really a little nervous about. He agreed to see me, and I was seeing him in the church, and we had he's, priest. I worked for a guy, G. McCarthy, who was a Benedictine, and spent a lot of time with him, and a lot of his friends were. They can be very. They're really very interesting and very lively and funny and private, and he was like that. And so I thought, maybe he just didn't know where I was going. And we're walking out on Fifth Avenue. He would spend a lot of time. I was interviewing for a book I was doing, or maybe something for the New York Times. I don't remember. And as we go out, he's walking me outside. He walks me out in Fifth. The church is on 51st and 5th. Beautiful place. It was one of those late March days. It was really nice in the 50s and sunny. And he walks me out, and as we go through the doors, he throws his arm around me. And he says, my son, he says, God put you here for a purpose, and you mustn't stop. He said, even if people don't like what you did and all that stuff, God put you here for this purpose. And I'm walking down the street thinking to myself, okay, there is faith, and this man really has it. And it leads to an awful lot of integrity. And that's what makes this so astonishing to me, that you could have such a lack of integrity, and it could be tolerated so long by so many people in the church. And so many stories you have in this book is about some priest getting a little boy, and upstairs where they shouldn't have little boys, an altar boy or a 12-year-old boy, and another priest walks in and they're actually engaged in rape, anal rape, and they, excuse me, Father, and they walk out. Not once. How many times? 3, 4 times? It's pretty profound stuff. Anyway, I'm selling books because you should read it. Goodbye.